Hello, and welcome to the Steve and Mark Discuss podcast, a place where you can hear two middle-aged guys discuss things. We're well balanced because we've got a chip on both shoulders. Anyway, over to my associate carpenter, Steve.
Hi, people. There was a little joke in there somewhere. So, what we're going to touch on today is the apparent truth about Ukraine. This information comes from Colonel Douglas McGregor. He's apparently in the US, he's the go-to guy. He's a retired colonel. But he knows everything about there is to know about military action that's going on. He gets a lot of information from the inside. And here we go about Ukraine. Up until now, around about 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers, between 400,000 and 450,000 Ukrainian soldiers that have died in this conflict. 40,000 just this last 2 months with this this thing that Ukraine is wanting to do, the counteroffensive that the Ukraine is wanting to do. Apparently, McGregor, he's saying that there are a lack of troops on the front line, and that some units of the Ukrainian army are surrendering because they can't get their wounded soldiers. They can't transport them back. The hospitals are full in the Ukraine, which is true. I've seen this in other sources of information. You know, there's no room in the hospitals, and the soldiers which are wounded on the front line are dying. So the Ukrainian soldiers, slowly but surely, are surrendering, and so that the Russians can take the wounded soldiers and take them to the hospital. Apparently, the Russian army are treating the prisoners of war well, and they are treating the wounded soldiers and just not letting them die. And that's where we are. The press in the West is still insisting that everything is well with Ukraine. The BBC is saying that the recent drones that Ukraine are sending are working well, which they aren't. You know, we've seen reports where there have been drone attacks on Moscow, for example, but majority of the drones were shot out of the sky anyway by the Russian artillery on the ground. And those drones that did hit were drones that were shot out of the sky and falling to earth and then hitting some buildings or other and exploding because they're full of explosives. But they didn't hit the targets that they were intended for. And coming out of the Times newspaper said that the fighting is being carried out in the wrong place, that the Ukrainian army are in the northeast, when they should be in the south fighting against Crimea, which is easy for the editor of the Times to put that in the newspaper because he isn't on the front line. You know, we've got people saying, newspapers, I think it was a Daily Mail, that said that the reason why there's a shortage of troops on the front line, or troops in general in Ukraine, is because men in Ukraine are avoiding joining the army, you know, because it's a conscript now, you know, you're conscripted now. And of course, you can understand this if the Ukrainian youngsters are avoiding joining the army because they know they're going to be sent to the front lines to die. You know, it's not called a meat grinder for nothing.
Mm.
And I said the other day that I think this conflict is just going to last for like another 6 weeks, 2 months, and then it's going to end. I've been reading in periodicals, in newspapers and online also, that people are already talking about the fact that Ukraine are going to lose and that they should negotiate the terms of a peace deal. Let's see what happens there. But I know that this war is not going to go for much longer, simply because winter is coming again.
Mm.
We all know what happened last year when winter became dug in, and everybody was sinking in the marshes. But then last year they had the numbers. This year they don't have the numbers, and I think as the Ukrainians are already surrendering, according to McGregor, then I just think it's going to be too much for them. One of my just let me finish this off, and then you'll.
Okay,
One of my sources for Ukraine is Alexander Mercouris. He has a podcast, and a lot of information he gets from the press from the East, because he speaks Russian and all this. He's never mentioned this about the Ukrainian soldiers surrendering. So I sent him a message to see. He's not replied to it yet, but I wanted to know if he'd been hearing this as well. All this information is coming from Colonel Douglas McGregor. Apparently, he's the go-to guy in the States for all things military.
Right. Obviously, there's always been a lot of confusion over what's happening, and war, the fog of war, as they call it. I mean, it's not new. It's as old as people have been having, as men have been having wars with each other. What's true, what's not, what's propaganda, what's not. Yeah, I mean, overall, I mean, we've all seen the YouTube videos which have been taken from video games. I've not seen any from the Russian side. It's been from the Ukrainian side, but you're never going to get anything from the Russian side that's going to be like that front line, probably. Nothing would surprise me now, but we almost got back when the war first started. We got the First World War, it'd be over by Christmas, almost. And it is, the Russians are still there. I mean, that's not disputed by anyone. Yeah, you can argue that territorially, yes, it's backwards and forwards. That's how war operates. The only decisive war I can remember in recent times reading about was the Falklands War, funny enough, which was a close-run thing. I mean, there were heavy losses there on the British side. The Argentinians did give a battle. Let's not forget that. That was said, you know, as a surprise. There were an army of conscripts. I mean, the real hardened troops there, the pros, were good. I believe they were British trained or something strange about that. But the yeah, I mean, now the figures of people dying, I think, yeah, the Ukrainians are going to be high. We don't know, never going to know how many the Russians lost. We're still disputing that from the end of World War II. Frightening figures. Even the conservative figures are frightening for that. Yeah, I mean, young men being called up conscripts, you're quite right. They've got a death sentence, basically. Yes, the video is all happy, smiling troops and all that. Men in difficult situations to make light of things, to take their mind away from it. That's normal. You read about things about World War I, World War II, some of the humour, particularly the British humour that I've read. The Germans are slightly different, but if you read, there's a film, All Quiet on the Western Front, which I read the book when I was at school, which is probably, if you want to know what war is like and its hell, read that. It's probably the best description of being up against it, and even that had humour in from the German perspective, for it's our enemy. So yeah, there's that side to it. Now, as to get how accurate things, these generals will be connected to people, and they will understand tactics in ways that we can't. I mean, again, we're no better than the Sunday Telegraph editor. Yeah, we can only speculate. We've got not a real context on the ground there. These guys probably have, even retired ones, and they'll understand. They'll look at a map and understand the strategies being used, which we want. And let's not forget the American generals would have studied Russian tactics. And you've got to remember, the Ukrainians are probably still using Russian trained tactics, because that's what be their go-to reference guides. They've not fought a war since the end of the Cold War, any more than we have, any more than anyone else has, really. As to Russian going on, I think Putin and the Russian generals, or anyone else seen it, is committed to this war remaining. They're not going to back down. We don't know how popular the war is in Russia. It's probably not got wholesale popularity. A lot of people probably won't understand it any more than we understand it.
In the case of Russia, I think Russia now is just containing itself. It isn't going out and out warring on Ukraine. It's got its borders, and it's hunkered down and defending. It's the Ukrainians that are trying to advance. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy.
It's the Ukrainians that are trying to advance, and they're getting bogged down in the minefields. And the swamps.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, it's their territory. They should know it, but it's difficult war. It's interesting. When it all first started, I heard a comment by somebody, probably a bit like this McGregor guy, and it says armchair generals talk about numbers of troops, real generals talk about logistics. If you're not supplying your army, you're lost. It doesn't matter if you've got 100 troops or 1 million. That's when I hear other people talk about other countries. I've got a million soldiers. How well trained are the soldiers to begin with? And can you actively get logistics across? It's like you say, if troops are getting bogged down in difficult conditions, that means they're not getting the ammunition. They're probably not getting the equipment through. And food. I mean, more importantly, you've got to feed them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to destroy morale.
Morale that's already been destroyed with the deaths.
Yeah, I mean, I dare say, when we talk about that, you've probably got Ukrainians don't want to be there any more than the Russians don't want to be there. And you've got to remember that, you've got two people, and we said this, who are not totally the same. Yeah, they're nationalistic, but they are effectively the same people. It's not a civil war. People say this about Ukraine and Ukraine. If you actually read the history book, and I've got a history book from the 90s here, that reading, and it tells you the history, that basically, yes, there are native Ukrainians, but basically it's Ukrainians and Russians mixed together.
It was a civil war in 2014.
Yeah.
Where, that was a civil war, and that's what started all this.
Well, yeah. And again, that slipped under the Obama administration, strangely enough. Again, NATO were powerless to do anything, didn't get involved. And again, NATO are effectively powerless to do anything now, in my opinion. The only way you're going to beat the Russians on the ground in a conventional ground war, and I'm saying conventional here, is to have NATO maybe going to support. You can give no end of weapons and everything else now. And I've just said about numbers. Let's remember, for every sophisticated weapon you give the Ukrainians, the Russians have probably got an equivalent. It might not be as good, but they've probably got the numbers on it. Russia have been getting onto war footings for years.
Yeah.
We're running out of it. Yeah. I mean, how much have the Russians got? Well, okay, they might have been using old equipment at first for the tanks, sacrificial tanks and things. I mean, the Russians. Let's remember, the Russian hierarchy aren't going to care how many people die. That's always been their way of doing it.
Well, I don't think any government does. I really don't think any government cares. I just think, when they say our hopes and prayers go to the families of all the fallen, it rolls off the tongue like it's like a formality.
Well, yeah, you got to say.
I don't think they're worried at all.
I mean, it's like I said, I mentioned a few weeks ago, I was going to join the army, the military, the army at one point. I was thinking about the navy as well at one point.
Mm.
And yeah, you are made quite clear that you are signing up, and that's your job. I mean, it's probably the British military is probably the biggest boys' club in the world, really, sport and everything else. Great life. But yeah, ultimately, it was made clear that it doesn't matter if you're an engineer, a medic, or someone else, you have to hold you will probably have to hold a rifle and fire it. That's your primary job. And you're going to be at the front. And
Right.
you sign up for that. And then, I've got no sympathy for, people that, when you sign up for it. And that's your job. Conscripting is a lot different. You get people that aren't going to want to be there, aren't loving it. Yeah. Are going to moan about everything. If you enjoyed this discussion, can you please like, subscribe and share it? Thank you.